So far we've looked at words, lexemes, as individual items and looked at them to some extent next to each other when we go to make up sentences. We now want to look at them as sets of items that are used or have been acquired for a particular purpose. We're going to call those vocabularies. Let's start by looking at total vocabularies, and later on we'll look at partial vocabularies. I don't know whether you've ever thought of the size of your own personal vocabulary. We tend to be rather self-conscious about the words we don't know, but we don't tend to jump up and down and cheer at the number of words we do know. Well, we actually do know lots of words. In fact, we generally know all the words that are going to be any use to us. The only words we don't know are the ones that we haven't found useful up to now, otherwise we would have acquired them. So, your personal vocabulary, how big is it? Probably somewhere around 50,000 words, which is not a bad effort really. Take a bow. Some of that is active. You use it when you're making new sentences yourself, and some of it is passive. That is, you understand it, but you wouldn't necessarily use it. One of the things that happens as one gets an education is items of passive vocabulary tend to move into the active vocabulary, although that's not necessarily the case. If you listen to weather forecasts on a frequent basis, there's a lot of terminology in there that you understand but you wouldn't necessarily use. Who wants to use the word deep depression on a regular basis? You don't come across a friend and say, "I say, terrible weather we're having." You might say that, but then you wouldn't say, "I understand there's a deep depression over the capital city." What about a language? What size is the total vocabulary of a language? Well, it depends. If the language is just a spoken language and has no written form, and it has a very small number of speakers, maybe only 100 or 2 left, as is happening with a number of the world's languages, then you might be able to sit down with the speakers and gradually figure out pretty much all of the vocabulary that they have together. Nevertheless, it's hard to assess the total vocabulary for any language because there might be some words that we've forgotten that we know, items of passive vocabulary that just wouldn't come up, and it's quite hard to test for vocabulary knowledge, particularly if it's large. Well, what happens to vocabularies is that they can grow, that is, words can be added to them, or, as we'll find later, they can also shrink. Words can disappear. There are 3 main processes involved, and we're going to deal with each of them. We've already dealt with one. Borrowing, which is copying a word from one language into another, that is, from one vocabulary into another. Word formation, which we have already looked at. Word formation is just compounding, derivation, and conversion. And finally, some odds and sods processes which I like to think of as word creation. Let's start with borrowing. One of the major ways in which languages increase their total vocabulary is through linguistic contact, by finding a vocabulary item in one language that is useful and putting it into your own language. Now, of course, borrowing suggests that it's been taken out of the other language, which isn't true. It stays behind. If we look at linguistic contact over the years, English has always had contact with French because the French are just across the English Channel from the English. And if we look at items relating to food and food preparation, quite a few items of vocabulary there have been borrowed, copied from French. The word for sheep in English is sheep, but sheep, when we eat it, is sometimes called mutton. Well, mutton is French mouton. We might have a casserole dish, casserole. We might make a fricassee. Well, none of those are native English words. They have been borrowed, that is, copied from French. Very early on in the Middle Ages, the Vikings came and gave the English a hard time. And during that period there was a lot of contact. In fact, people from Scandinavia settled in England, and they're still there. We just don't notice they're there anymore, but they settled. For example, the word egg, which you would think is terribly English. Well, it isn't actually. Not originally. The word egg came from the Vikings. Before the Vikings came, the word was eier, which is the same as the word in Dutch, because Dutch and English are quite closely related. But the Norse version of eier is egg. There are towns in the north of England ending in by, for example, Grimsby. That by is a Norse word meaning dwelling. So Grimsby was the dwelling of Grim, and Grim is also a Norse proper noun. So this was the dwelling of Grim. Norse borrowings have been in English for at least 1,000 years, and we're so used to them we don't notice them anymore. What happens with traffic direction when two languages are in contact, two people speaking different languages are in contact? Which way does the traffic go? Does everybody borrow in one direction, or does it go in both directions? We can look at that in cases of colonization. English has become the language of the colonizers in Africa, in the Caribbean, in America, in Australia, Canada, New Zealand. How do things go? Do we find in the native languages lots of English? Do we find lots of native copying into the other language? Well, in the case of New Zealand, we've got some idea about that. There are lots of English words in Maori, and you can track these. You can note what has happened to a vocabulary item. Obviously, this often has to do with technology, with new things that you might as well just use the English word. Of course, in the process, you no longer notice that it's an English word. It gets translated in its sound pattern into a Maori word. But there are also lots of Maori words in New Zealand English. You'll notice that wherever you are in the world, there's a traffic direction. You can look at South African English, and there are words from native languages of South Africa in South African English, just as there are English words in a number of native languages of South Africa. The traffic direction is often a function of what is perceived as cultural or technological superiority. In contemporary Japanese, huge numbers of English words are being borrowed every year, and in terms of their written form, it's very important in Japanese to give them the right characters. So every year characters have to be invented for English borrowed words, and you'll find that there are books that come out every year indicating what the written system is going to have representing a particular new borrowing. Word formation, as you'll recall, we've already dealt with. Compounding, derivation, and conversion are the ways in which word formation can add new vocabulary to a language from its internal resources. The language already has the lexemes and the morphemes out of which these new words are made. What about word creation? These are more unusual kinds of word formation, and therefore much more interesting, really. First of all, there are words called blends. There are not many of these, but what you do when you make up a blend is you do something like a compound, only you basically take the front end of one word and the back end of another, and you jam them together. For example, avionics is aviation electronics. Right, so what have we got here? AV from aviation, and onics from electronics. Avionics are the electronics used in the aviation industry. So, for example, in jet fighters there are now things called heads-up displays where some of the dials and gauges are shown in the glass on the windscreen of the plane so that the pilot can see everything and also see through the window at the same time. Smoke is one English word and fog is another English word. When you mix smoke with fog, what you get is smog. So the first two sounds of one of those words and the last two letters of the other have been put together and we get smog. You can make up new ones of this kind, but they're quite hard to get accepted. Acronyms, however, are incredibly common in English. They've only been common for the last while, and they seem to be a result of bureaucratic processes and the desire to get brief versions of what are otherwise quite long strings of words. They turn up a huge amount in governments. Capital cities are loaded down with acronyms made up by state bureaucrats. Basically, there are two fundamental ways of making up an acronym. The first is that you can put together the first letter or the first sound of a whole phrase. For example, UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. And you'll see that the first letters have just been jammed together and turned into a word. It's a nice word because it's a legitimate English word. There are a number of combinations of letters which don't make up a word itself. So, for example, the Food and Drug Organization in authority in America is called the FDA. FDA doesn't go very well. Then there's a second way of doing acronyms, which is to take the first syllable of a word and put those first syllables together into a new word. So the secret police under the Nazi regime in Germany were called the Gestapo. Gestapo, short for Geheime Staatspolizei. Geheime Staatspolizei, Gestapo. Acronyms of that sort are common in Russian, and they're quite common on the continent. So we basically have acronyms made up out of individual letters, which are the first letters of something, a longer phrase, and ones made up out of syllables. And we can also make a distinction between those that are pronounceable, like UNESCO, and ones that aren't. Both of those are called acronyms, but I think that the ones that aren't pronounceable probably don't constitute words. I'm not sure what to call them, so that FDA is just saying the letters one after the other. I don't think it's a word. Root creation you would think would be easy to do. We've got any number of sounds in the language, 26 letters, and we could just make up a new word. Well, it happens very little that a new root word is created from scratch. It may be that the word Exxon was created that way. Originally, the brand name for the range of petroleum products that is now called Exxon was Esso, E-S-S-O. And rumour has it that Esso was a word with bad connotations in some societies, so as the company which marketed these petroleum products marketed them in other parts of the world, the word Esso, when it was borrowed into those languages, was a rude word, and that wasn't good for the company. So it changed things to, the S's were changed to X's, E-S-S-O became E-X-X-O, Exo, and then they thought, oh well, let's put an N on the end because then it sounds something like neutron and proton and all of those nice science words. Brand new word, Exxon. Echo words are words that sound something like the thing that they denote. And again, you would think that that would be quite common, so that a grader might be called squeak, because a lot of graders squeak. Again, it happens very little. It does happen quite a lot with birds, and the process, of course, is onomatopoeia. In New Zealand English, the little native owl is called moorpork, because I suppose someone listened to it making its little call up in the tree and thought, oh yes, that sounds like moorpork. Moorpork. It probably had nothing to do with what the little owl ate. The peewit is an English bird which makes it sound something like that, but you've got to be very careful with onomatopoeia. While moorpork sounds like an owl may be to an English speaker, in Maori the word for exactly the same little native owl is ruru. So in Maori this little owl says ruru, and in English it says moorpork. Well, it actually doesn't say either. The sound is just a bird call, and onomatopoeia is very much conditioned by the language in which the onomatopoeia is rendered. That leads us to the notion that words are coined. Somewhere, at some time, a word is used for the first time by somebody. Somebody back in Nazi Germany used the word Gestapo for the first time. At that point the word was coined. Fine. But lots of words are coined and don't end up in the vocabulary of a language. In other words, they're not lexicalized. Lexicalization involves taking a word that has been coined and turning it into a vocabulary item in the language. And that's essentially a social matter. Very few words are just the individual preserves of individual speakers, for the simple reason that if you were the only one that knew it, you couldn't communicate with anybody else if you used that word. So lexicalization is the social process whereby, over time, a word which has been coined becomes part of the vocabulary of the whole language.